All right, welcome to this video for this week, for this lesson. This is the lesson over Chapter 8, Lesson 3. So with this lesson, we're going to finish up talking about the development, the ratification of the Constitution, everything that's in it. Let's go ahead and start with this Bellwork so we can jump right into it. Again, I usually give you about 5 minutes to work on the Bellwork. This Bellwork is a little bit different, structured a little bit differently, and we'll talk about that here in a minute. But let's go ahead and just take a minute. Go ahead and pause the video and work on this to the best of your ability, and we'll talk about it when you come back. So I will expect you to pause it in 3, 2, 1. All right, so the Bellwork, yeah. So this one, like I said, a little bit different. You have 4 speakers. One that says a strong central government will provide order and stability. You have, we have just left the control of one tyrant. Let us avoid an American tyrant. And then you have the strength of our union lies in the independence of our states. So that's there. And then you have Speaker 4, we were led into a war by a minority who desired independence. So 4 different speakers, and the question is, which speaker is in favor of ratifying the Constitution? Let's think about this. Okay. Don't get the Constitution confused with the Articles of Confederation. With the Articles of Confederation, they absolutely did not want another tyrant. They said, we are escaping from the British, from their rule, from this really strict, tyrannical government. We don't want a strong government. We want a very weak government that allows the states to be very strong. So Speaker 2 and Speaker 3 really address this, but that's the Articles of a Confederation. Absolutely true. Those were the sentiments, but it was for the Articles of Confederation. Speaker 4 says, we were led into a war by a minority who desired independence. Now think about that. Who was that? Right? Who would have said that? See, that wouldn't have even been the Patriots. That would have been the Loyalists. The Loyalists would have said that the minority brought us into this war. And most people here don't even want to separate. That would have been their little sour grapes on the side. Anyway, so Speaker 1 really speaks to the Constitution because after the Articles of Confederation coming back into the Congress, kind of going back to the drawing board of sorts, they were saying, listen, we've tried the weak government. It just wasn't strong enough. It was too weak. We need to have a strong central government that will provide order and stability, and therefore the answer to this question is Speaker 1, and we've already talked about why. So today, we're going to understand again how governments change and the ideal that went into our Constitution. Which ideals went into what makes us us, and where do we get those ideas? We're going to talk about a lot of that today. We're going to go over those notes, and we're going to do a little bit of a review. There is a test on Friday. If you were in class on Monday, it's January 30th, which is when the date is for this, then you would know that. If you were on A Day, which is tomorrow, then yours will be actually on Monday of next week. 3, 4, 5. So it'll be on the 6th. Okay, so the test for Chapter 7 for B Day classes is on Friday the 3rd. The test for A Day classes is on Monday the 6th. All right, let's go ahead and review our pride characteristics. So be prepared, be respectful, have integrity, be dependable, and as always, have etiquette. Respect other people, be respectful, and be appropriate when you're in class and in the hallways. Keep up with your planners and study and keep up with your assignments. Always important. So Chapter 7, assessment. Now don't get worried about that assessment. This isn't a test. It's just what your book calls kind of like a chapter review. So that's what it is. But let's talk about this. So it's time for review. We're looking back in time to Chapter 7. Let's go ahead and go in for that. Now, the numbers aren't going to go in sequential order per se. We're not going 1, 2, 3, 4. These numbers coincide with the numbers in your book's chapter assessment or chapter review. So what factors led to Washington's success in the attack on Trenton? What I'm going to do is go ahead and open up your online book in a different tab in your browser. Kind of get that ready. Then come back here and answer this question. I'm going to pause for a few seconds, pause the video, go ahead and answer the question, and then we'll talk about it here in a minute. All right, so coming back, what factors led to Washington's success in the attack on Trenton? That's going to be this surprise attack. You have Washington and his men. You can see here in this picture, Washington and his men crossing the Delaware River. It's iconic. Did it look just like that? No, it didn't look just like that. It wasn't winter, but they weren't trying to break through the ice like that shows it. It was a little bit dramatic, and he probably wasn't standing up in the boat when they crossed over. And it was at night as well. It was in the dark of night. So they went in the dark of night in a surprise attack. Not only was it a surprise attack, but it was at Christmas. The forces were divided, so they were unprepared. And I would even add to this that when they were attacking these troops, most of them were the Hessian mercenaries. So they weren't in it anyway. They were easily defeated. They gave up pretty quickly. Very little of a struggle, and that's really why they were able to win for that. Now, question number 4, that's what we're doing next, is what were conditions like for Washington's troops in the winter of 1778 at Valley Forge? If you are using your book, it's page 203. If you are in your online book, that's not going to make sense, but basically it should be pretty easy to find Valley Forge in the online book. So again, I'm going to pause here and go ahead and pause the video if you need to look it up. So what were the conditions like for Washington's troops in the winter of 1778 at Valley Forge? If you remember back in our notes in our lecture, it was very cold, obviously because it was winter, but it was extremely cold. The conditions were very harsh. It wasn't like Texas winters where you have a little bit of a light kind of a layer of snow. This was thick snow. It lasted a long time. They didn't have supplies. A lot of the men didn't have boots or shoes. They didn't have the blankets necessary, the coats necessary. They didn't have shelter. There was very little food, and they weren't getting many supply shipments in, if any at all. Many of them actually became sick and died. Others deserted, which means they left without permission. And that was a big part of the challenge for Washington, was how to keep his troops together. Okay, next question. How did the drafting of the Declaration of Independence affect the French Revolution in 1789? Okay, once again, I'm going to pause for a second and allow you to answer this question. Okay. How did the drafting of the Declaration of Independence affect the French Revolution in 1789? The Declaration of Independence had in its core this idea of independence, of freedom, of this idea that all people have freedom, right? So the principles of freedom, and I'm just going to read it from what it says here on the screen. The principles of freedom and rights outlined in the Declaration of Independence inspired similar rebellions in other parts of France, other parts of the world rather, including France. France had this kind of a motto of liberty, fraternity, and equality. It's a little different. It's not exactly, I mean, their revolution isn't exactly our revolution. It wasn't the same kind of situation, and it definitely didn't have the same kind of result. But understand that this idea that we do have rights are worth fighting for, that is what inspired the French Revolution to happen. Now, would it have happened anyway? Probably. Would it have happened in the same way? Probably not. So it definitely did have a big impact and influence. Okay. Why was the Battle of Saratoga a turning point in the American Revolution? If you do have a book, this is on page 201. I'm going to go ahead and pause, and we'll pick it up there. All right, so why was the Battle of Saratoga, listen to me, why was the Battle of Saratoga the turning point in the American Revolution? It's because it brought in Spain and France. You know, for the first time, France and Spain thought, man, you know, they actually could win this thing. They can win a battle. So you had to prove yourself before they would even come in. I mean, they gave a little bit of money, but actually committing their troops, they weren't willing to do that unless they had a pretty good idea that there was a victory ahead of them. So that Patriot victory really did make a big impact on why France and Spain both entered the war. And of course, you know, them winning the war, or them entering the war, gave us a big advantage. You know, we weren't in this by ourselves. We had some trained, experienced soldiers, not just militia. That really helped us when we needed it in the war. Okay, at this point, what I did in class was I handed out the Quizlet study guide for Chapter 7. So all the questions that we just went over, plus this study guide on Quizlet, that's what you need to study for Friday. It's all stuff we've gone over. You have the notes. You have the study guide. It should just be a matter of reviewing that information, which we're doing today in the form of what we just did. And then we'll go over the study guide more on Wednesday, and then Friday coming in and taking the test. So make sure that you're getting on that. Make sure you're using those flashcards. Make sure you're doing what you need to do to be prepared for that test. If you need a copy of it, come and see me. Otherwise, I will send you the link via Remind or email or however else I can get that to you. But definitely make sure that you're going and reviewing that. Okay, beating that dead horse. So for the TEKS today, we are going to look at the creation and ratification of the Constitution and how that came about. We're also going to look at arguments for and against the ratification, the passing of the Constitution, making it a law. We're going to look at some of these documents like the Magna Carta, the English Bill of Rights, the Mayflower Compact we're not going to look at as much, but we will look at Federalist and Anti-Federalist papers and writings, and the U.S. system of government. So that whole thing we're going to talk about today, with the exception of the Mayflower Compact. We're going to identify the grievances that we talked about. You know, what were the grievances? What are some of the grievances that led us to write documents like the Articles of Confederation, the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Bill of Rights? We're going to look at how the U.S. reflects the principles of limited government, republicanism, checks and balances, federalism, separation of powers, popular sovereignty, and individual rights. We will begin that today, and we're going to be talking about that for the next 2 weeks probably, maybe even more than that. And we're going to summarize the purposes for and process of amending the U.S. Constitution. More of purpose for today. We'll worry about the process of amending later. We have already talked about that earlier in the year. But we're going to revisit that. We're going to analyze the arguments of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists, including Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry, James Madison, George Mason, all very important ones. Important people for you to know and remember. Please do that. And then 20A, we're going to explain the role of individuals like, let's see, today we're going to talk about Charles de Montesquieu and John Locke specifically. Those two guys will be in this lesson. And we're going to evaluate the contributions of the Founding Fathers and kind of what they did. Now, one of the things that some of the students got confused about is when we say framers of the Constitution, frame, you know, think about the framers or a framer. We're not talking about farmers. Don't get that word confused because it looks very similar. A framer is this: if you were going to build a house and you were going to build the frame of that house, there are people that they're in that construction site that's what they do. They come in and they build the framework of that. It's not, you're not going to see it in the finished product necessarily, but they're going to build the structure, and then around that structure, they're going to build the house around that. It's the shell of that house or of that building even. And then, you know, over time they start building and adding to it, making it a pretty building that you want to live in. Well, that's what the framers of this nation did. the framers of the Constitution. They built the structure, the framework of what the government was going to look like, and then people added the prettiness to it to make it, what we have today over time. But lesson 3, a new plan of government. Here we go. Make sure you have a copy of your notes in front of you. If you don't, you can print one out, or you can come and pick one up from me, and that way it'll make it easier for you to fill this out. But I don't mind emailing it to you, providing it via Remind, or any other way that I can do to make sure that you have what you need to be successful in this class. So the Constitution's success. Well, although it's an American document, right? It's in America, it's by patriots and all that. We get the idea from other civilizations, not just from America. They didn't just, think about it for a few days and come up with a good idea. They read books. They read what was going on. They knew about other countries. They knew what other people had said, and they brought that to the table. So the framers, they had pulled from the British parliamentary system. Parliament is the British Congress. So the people that make the laws in Britain, that's Parliament. And we'll look at a picture of that here in a minute. Others, they were part of their colonial or state assemblies, and that played a big part. This part isn't in your notes, and I apologize for that, but something that I do want you to be familiar with. We have talked about each one of these before, and they should be in your notes from before, but if you want, go ahead and jot this down somewhere on your notes. The English Magna Carta. This placed limits on the power of the monarch. If you have a king that is all-powerful, he has 100% of the power. If you even give one slice of that, one little sliver of that away to the people or to some other body or entity, then he doesn't have all 100% power. So giving power to somebody takes power away from somebody else. That's just the way it works. And so the first time that happened that we took from was in 1215 in the English Magna Carta. Parliament. This is the lawmaking body. This is, again, the group of people that make the laws in England. One of the things that they made was the English Bill of Rights. It's another model for the Americans. We weren't the first ones to do a Bill of Rights. The English did it before we did. And some people thought that it was a great idea that we had it. Some people thought it wasn't necessary. But that's one of the influences from Europe. Another is and this is why we don't just say Britain was our influence, but other civilizations, because all across Europe, there's something called the Enlightenment period. This is a movement in the 1700s where reason and science and knowledge and achievement, in all kinds of areas, people having new ideas and new thoughts, all writing them down, and influenced so many other nations. People including the Baron de Montesquieu and John Locke. We've talked about John Locke several times this year. There's a picture of the British Parliament in case you want to see it. There's Big Ben, the big clock tower, and then where Parliament meets. Something definitely that you would want to see when you go there. I've never been to England, but I would love to go there and see that. I think it'd be fascinating. But let's talk about the Baron de Montesquieu. His first name was Charles. Baron, again, is a title. Don't get that confused. Baron is a title, not a name. And it's the spirit of laws. That's what he wrote in 1748, talking about the separation of powers. And these people are just sitting around and they're thinking these thoughts. They're thinking, what is a law? What makes a law? Can you have laws, real laws, with a monarch, with a king? And Montesquieu said, I don't think so. I don't think you can have an all-powerful, 100% of the power person and have a law, because a law needs checks and balances, right? If you're the only one that has all the power, well, even if there is a law, you don't have to follow it because you're all-powerful. So if you're going to have a law, you need to have somebody there to check you on that if you break the law, they're going to hold you accountable, even if you're the king. So that was his thought behind the spirit of laws, and we got that idea of separation of powers from him. Now, John Locke, the two treaties of civil government in 1690, so it was quite a long time before Montesquieu wrote his, but we got these ideas of social contract, natural God-given rights, and limited governmental power. Social contract, this is, even when we're in class, we are in a social contract because you're of your own free will coming into class, following the rules, listening, learning, that's your part. My part is I'm teaching you. So we enter into a social contract together. We don't write anything, but it's just a given that if you're in my class, you're going to follow the rules. I'm going to teach. I can't come in here and lay down for an hour and a half and just say, okay, thanks for coming, see you guys later. Then I'm not fulfilling my side of the social contract. If you come in and you're disruptive and you don't follow the rules, then you're not fulfilling your side of the social contract. So we both have equal part in that. And that's what John Locke said it is between us and government. Natural, God-given rights, this is a foundation. He said, there are rights that cannot be taken away. There are inalienable rights that cannot be taken away. We cannot be alienated from them. And government should have limited power. All things that John Locke said and believed in. Okay, so we're going to watch a video about federalism. Shouldn't be too long, just a couple, 2 or 3 minutes. And basically, it's going to talk about everything that we're going to talk about here in a minute. So enjoy.
Federalism is about government power. Federalism means that power is divided between a national government and state or provincial governments. In the United States, some powers belong to the national government in Washington, D.C., and other powers belong to the state governments, such as the state government in New York.
So a division of power.
We call the national government in Washington, D.C. the federal government. In addition to the national government in Washington, D.C., there's a government in each state, so 50 state governments. Because of federalism, some powers belong to the federal government and other powers belong to the state governments. One power of the federal government is to regulate trade between the states. Another power of the federal government is to declare war. States have powers too. States have their own laws and their own police. States also generally run their own schools. Some powers are shared. For example, both the federal and state governments have the power to tax. Why does the United States have a system of federalism? Remember, Americans fought the Revolutionary War to gain independence from Britain. The 13 former colonies became 13 independent states. States were concerned about losing power to other states. States were also concerned about losing their power to the national government. However, many Americans realized they needed a central government strong enough to unite the country. So on the one hand, state governments did not want a national government so strong that there would be tyranny, but a central government that was too weak could not unite the country. Federalism was a compromise. Federalism provides some power to the national government in Washington, D.C., and other powers belong to each of the states. Because of federalism, there are
So this idea of federalism is this idea that you have this sharing situation between the national government and the state government, the federal or national government and the states. This thing like you see in this picture, right? 2 kids playing, trying to share the toys. Well, if one kid is playing with a toy, the other kid isn't playing with the toy. You have one kid playing with the elephant, well, then the other kid can't play with the elephant. But sometimes, in certain situations, both kids can play with the same elephant at the same time. That's the idea of federalism. Federalism is sharing power between the federal and state governments. The Constitution created a federal system of government that divided powers between the national federal government and the states. So you have, again, some power is going to go to the national government, some power to the state government. So it's equally divided, kind of, not really equally, but you get the idea. The government, the national government, could tax. They can regulate trade nationally. They can control the currency, so they can figure out what kind of money everybody's going to use. They can raise an army, declare war. Now that they can tax, they can pay for that, and they can make laws that were necessary and proper. This phrase, necessary and proper. Well, who determines if it's necessary? Who determines if it's proper? Remember that. We'll come back to that later, but necessary and proper, very, very important concept that you're going to need to remember. Okay, the states kept the power to control trade inside their borders. So the national government, the federal government, can control trade in the United States, but in that state, within those borders, like the state of Texas can control trade within the state of Texas. That's one of those shared responsibilities. You know, it's two different regulations that people would need to understand. They could also set up local governments and schools and establish marriage and divorce laws. You'll see that this kind of becomes a problem that we're going to have to solve, because if somebody gets married in Georgia and then they go up to Virginia, Virginia was telling them, hey, you're not married here. You're married in Georgia, but now you're single in Virginia. I'm sure the wife would have had something to say about that, but definitely it was causing problems, because we needed something in the law that said we were going to honor the contracts in another state, even though it was not that state that it happened in. And both federal and state governments would have the power to tax, and both would have a criminal justice system. So again, you would see even today we have state taxes and federal taxes. We have state laws and federal laws, you know, felonies and misdemeanors, and you know, all kind of different law levels. The Constitution and the laws of Congress were to be the supreme law of the land. This is the overarching law of the land that's over everybody. This solves the problem of who's stronger, who's more powerful, the state government or the federal government. Well, this says the federal government is the bottom line. The states cannot pass a law that violates the Constitution. Now listen to what I said now. They cannot write or pass a law that violates the Constitution. But if the U.S. government passes a law that is not a part of the Constitution, they can violate that all day. One of the ones that makes sense to a lot of people, that's why I use it in class, is that law on marijuana. Right? Nationally, marijuana is illegal, but certain states have passed laws that say that marijuana is illegal. Another one is gay and lesbian rights for marriage. Nationally, before the Supreme Court decided what they decided, nationally it was illegal for two men to get married or two women to get married, but in the states they made it legal, so people would flood to those states to get married and hope that they honored it in other states. Now it's not that issue. Now people can get married pretty much wherever they want, however they want. Federal courts would settle disputes between the federal government and the states on the basis of the Constitution. So the federal courts, that's the Supreme Court, which is at the top of that chain. There are other federal courts, but the Supreme Court being the main one, they're going to look to the Constitution to decide, is this constitutional or is it unconstitutional? Let's look at the branches of government. First of all, you have the legislative branch, and this is in Article 1 of the Constitution. The House of Representatives and the Senate both make up this branch. We're not going to go into detail about these today. We will go in depth when we talk about the Constitution. We're all going to read it. We're all going to be responsible, but we have to understand that the legislative branch is in Article 1 because they thought it was most important. This is it. Now, the legislative branch in Article 1, Paragraph 1, the U.S. government says that the legislative branch has all power, A-L-L, all power, dealing with legislative responsibility. So Congress shall have all legislative power. That's in there. It's very specific. It doesn't always work that way, because if the president creates an executive order, well, that's legislative responsibility, right? That's legislative authority. If the Supreme Court makes a decision that in essence creates policy and law, well, then that's legislative power. That's not the process to pass a law. That's not the same thing. It says all legislative power resides in Congress. Well, that isn't exactly the way it works out in practice. The executive branch, that is in Article 2. And one thing that we'll look at again later on when we talk about the Constitution is that the way that it works is you have the Constitution as one document that's broken up into chapters or articles, like Article 1, Article 2. Then you go down into paragraphs, so Article 1, Paragraph 1, and then you can go into clauses within those paragraphs. So Article 1, Paragraph 1, the blankety blank clause, whatever clause that is, right? It's the when we're talking about the First Amendment and the free exercise clause, or the right to petition, clause, that whatever clause is in there. All right, so in the executive branch, this is the section or the part of the government that enforces those laws that the legislative branch passes. So it's got the president and the vice president. It's got the FBI, the police, the military, the Treasury Department, lots of people, thousands of people working underneath the executive branch to make that happen. And then you have the judicial branch under Article 3, which involves the Supreme Court and lower federal courts. And you see the 9 Supreme Court justices there in that picture. Okay, another quick video and then we'll move on.
Have you ever wondered who has the authority to make laws or punish people who break them? When we think of power in the United States, we usually think of the president, but he does not act alone. In fact, he is only one piece of the power puzzle, and for very good reason. When the American Revolution ended in 1783, the United States government was in a state of change. The Founding Fathers knew that they did not want to establish another country that was ruled by a king. So the discussions were centered on having a strong and fair national government that protected individual freedoms and did not abuse its power. When the new Constitution was adopted in 1787, the structure of the infant government of the United States called for 3 separate branches, each with their own powers, and a system of checks and balances. This would ensure that no one branch would ever become too powerful, because the other branches would always be able to check the power of the other 2. These branches work together to run the country and set guidelines for us all to live by. The legislative branch is described in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. Many people feel that the Founding Fathers put this branch in the document first because they thought it was the most important. The legislative branch is comprised of 100 U.S. senators and 435 members in the U.S. House of Representatives. This is better known as the U.S. Congress. Making laws is a primary function of the legislative branch, but it is also responsible for approving federal judges and justices, passing the national budget, and declaring war. Each state gets 2 senators and some number of representatives depending on how many people live in that state. The executive branch is described in Article 2 of the Constitution. The leaders of this branch of government are the president and vice president, who are responsible for enforcing the laws that Congress sets forth. The president works closely with a group of advisors known as the cabinet. These appointed helpers assist the president in making important decisions within their area of expertise, such as defense, the Treasury, and homeland security. The executive branch also appoints government officials, commands the armed forces, and meets with leaders of other nations. All that combined is a lot of work for a lot of people. In fact, the executive branch employs over 4 million people to get everything done. The third branch of the U.S. government is the judicial branch and is detailed in Article 3. This branch is comprised of all the courts in the land, from the federal district courts to the U.S. Supreme Court. These courts interpret our nation's laws and punish those who break them. The highest court, the Supreme Court, settles disputes among states, hears appeals from state and federal courts, and determines if federal laws are constitutional. There are 9 justices on the Supreme Court, and unlike any other job in our government, Supreme Court justices are appointed for life, or for as long as they want to stay. Our democracy depends on an informed citizenry, so it is our duty to know how it works and what authority each branch of government has over its citizens. Besides voting, chances are that sometime in your life you'll be called upon to participate in your government, whether it is to serve on a jury, testify in court, or petition your congressperson to pass or defeat an idea for a law. By knowing the branches, who runs them, and how they work together, you can be involved, informed, and intelligent.
So good video there. Again, just talking about checks and balances. So checks and balances, it's something you're going to hear just about every year between now and the time you graduate, and even after that, you're going to hear it a lot. The Constitution creates a system of what's called checks and balances because if somebody does something, there needs to be somebody else to check to make sure that was okay for them to do and to balance out that power so that that one branch doesn't become too powerful. This means that the government has ways to limit the power of the other branches so that they don't become too powerful. So the president doesn't become a king, so that Congress doesn't become this group of 535 people who become kind of all part of one all-powerful group of people, so that the Supreme Court doesn't become a group of 9 all-powerful people that become bullies, any of them. They want to divide that power up. With this system, no single branch can gain too much power in the government. So very, very important. Okay, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Well, Federalists and Anti-Federalists are people that were arguing over the Constitution. The Federalists were people that wanted the Constitution to be passed. They liked it. They liked the idea of this federalism concept. They wanted it to happen. There were people who did not want us to sign the Constitution. They were called Anti-Federalists. So Federalists liked it. Anti-Federalists didn't. Okay, make sure you're keeping that distinction very, very clear in your mind. You could buy books today with the Federalist Papers in one, other books with the Anti-Federalist Papers. I have a copy of each with me in my office. If you want to look at it, you're more than welcome. You can also find them online. But Federalist Papers, some of the people that wrote it were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Jay, all under the collective name Publius, which, kind of like, some people say, John Q. Public, or just the public. This is us speaking up for the people. Then you had the Anti-Federalist Papers. One of the main authors was Thomas Jefferson. Other people also wrote it, or wrote Federalist Papers in there. Some of them we don't know the name of, that we just know them as like Brutus or Cato, people like that. Several state conventions announced that they weren't going to ratify the Constitution unless it had a Bill of Rights, which was not included. They did not issue or include a Bill of Rights in the Constitution, and so this was a big source of strife. As a matter of fact, George Mason, an anti-federalist from Virginia, said this. He said, there's not a Declaration of Rights, and the laws of the government, of the general government being paramount. That word paramount means all important, major, mega, big deal, the biggest consideration. He said that the laws of the general government being paramount to the laws of the Constitution of the states. In other words, that the Constitution is going to have to be bigger than the states, and the Declaration of Rights in the separate states is not security. We can't depend on the states to protect our rights. We have to have a Bill of Rights nationally that the states have to abide by. We said we just got to have it, which does make sense, but one of the reasons he did not really want to sign the Declaration of Independence, and if you remember back, George Mason, also was one of the people that did not sign the Articles of Confederation. For that, he was very much. There was things that he didn't like. He was not kind of in favor of several things, but one of the 3 that did not sign at the Constitutional Convention, one of the 3 that did not sign the Constitution when it was passed, and his reason was because it didn't have a Bill of Rights in it. So he did not sign it then, and he continued to argue against it even when it went to the states for ratification. So ratifying the Constitution, December 7th, 1787, Delaware became the first state to approve the Constitution. Delaware became the first state to approve the Constitution. By June 21st, 1788, the ninth state, New Hampshire, ratified. Now, according to the rules, 9 states is all you need. You didn't need anybody else. 9 states, it's official, it's approved. But is it? I mean, by the letter of the law of what was agreed upon, yes, you only needed 9 states. But man, if you don't have big states like Virginia and New York, you really don't have full support of the country. That's a lot of people in Virginia and New York. And if you don't have those people behind this document, it's not going to be very effective as you move forward. So you really need to have that. Now in Virginia, Anti-Federalist Patrick Henry claimed that the Constitution did not place enough limits on governmental power. Again, Anti-Federalist, he does not want a strong central government. He's against federalism. And he's saying we need to have limits to that power. Again, the Declaration of Rights, or the Bill of Rights, is one way to limit government power, because if you grant rights to the people, you are taking away rights from the government, or power from the government. So if you give, the more rights you give to people, the less powerful your government is. The more rights and power you give to the states, the less powerful the national government is. And he wanted to see that in there. Now, after being promised, because they said, listen, if you guys sign it, I'll tell you what, we promise that we will put a Bill of Rights in there, but we have to get this in place now and worry about rights later, but we will do it. We promise we will. And they did. So in 1788, Virginia signed, then New York, North Carolina, and then Rhode Island. And then the Bill of Rights came in 1791. So years after the Bill of Rights was signed, after the Constitution was ratified. Yay! Okay, so now what I want you to do is go ahead and work on the review with me here. What we're going to do, this is the lesson review. If you have it online in your online book, go for it. If not, just read through the questions here and answer it based on what you already said. We'll go ahead and talk about it here. But explain the relationship between the following terms: the Electoral College and the Executive Branch. We didn't specifically mention it here, but it is in your book. Also, well, we already said that. Actually, let's go through. Yeah. Explain the significance of the following terms: federalism, the legislative branch, judicial branch, checks and balances, and amendment. Basically, what I want you to do is to give me the definition of these terms. So go ahead and define these terms for me. All right, next, how is federalism reflected in the U.S. Constitution? So go ahead and answer that. And also, there's a quote here by George Mason. There's the one we just read: there is not a Declaration of Rights and the laws of the general government being paramount to the laws and constitutions of the several states. The Declaration of Rights in the separate states is no security. What I want you to do is read that and find out, how did the addition of the Bill of Rights in the Constitution address his concerns? How did that solve this problem? And we talked about it just a few minutes ago, so that should be there. So go ahead and make sure you complete that. For regular classes, not honors, you're just in the regular classes, what I want you to do is to write a letter to the framer. On page 248, there's the section of the Bill of Rights. There's that section that we actually did the notes on. And what I want you to do is write a letter to the framers of the Constitution and tell them why it's necessary to include the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Make that argument for me. Why is it important? Why would you argue, like with George Mason, that it's essential that we have a Bill of Rights, but write it in a letter format? All right? In class, you would have 15 minutes to do this, but you're doing it for homework. You can take your time or whatever you have, but just make it about a half page and single spaced, written neatly, and turn it in when you get back to class. All right. Now, let me skip past here just a little bit. These are things that we would go over, but for the honors classes, what we're going to do is we're going to do another assignment. I'll wait to give you your assignment when we come back into class because we did not get to it, but we will have an assignment in class. All right, that's going to be it for today. As always, let me get back to the planner part. Make sure that you have this in your planners, everything that you're needing to do. That's always going to be a part of the end of our class. Make sure that you're filling out your planners so that you stay organized and stay ahead of the curve. Okay, stay in front of your work and have a great attitude in all your classes. Love you guys. I'll see you next time.